On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, tonight I'm very pleased to introduce our program with Timothy Geithner and David Gergen, discussing Geithner's new book, Stress Test: Reflections on Financial Crises. As the 75th Secretary of Treasury, Timothy Geithner played a central role in forming U.S. domestic and international economic policy during President Barack Obama's first term. He first joined the Treasury Department in 1988 and has held numbers of positions in 3 administrations. Mr. Geithner is now the author of Stress Test: Reflections on Financial Crises, called a sharply worded and candid memoir by the Financial Times, and Barney Frank calls Stress Test first-rate economic history and insightful political science. Joining the conversation tonight is David Gergen, a senior political analyst for CNN, a professor of public service, and co-director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. Harvard Bookstore is very pleased to host tonight's discussion. Please join me in welcoming Timothy Geithner and David Gergen.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for what promises to be a very enlightening and possibly spirited session. I'm delighted to see such a big crowd here. I've been here before, Tim, and you filled the place. Congratulations. You should be very proud of this. And many of them are people who have already bought your book.
Possible.
Well, it's just possible. It's just possible. Well, we're honored that you're here. And I must say, I believe you were the 75th Secretary of the Treasury, and you're the first to have written a memoir that debuted number 4 on the bestseller list. So that's quite an achievement. You've been right there at the center. You were there right smack in the middle, and what we're going to be talking about mostly tonight is someone who was at the center of the storm when this country went from boom to bust, in his words, to rescue to recovery. And that's what we're going to be talking about. We'll have a conversation here between us for about 40 minutes, and then we'll turn to your questions. I think you know the drill. You can send in written questions. And we could start right at the beginning of the time you were Secretary of the Treasury, or back in 2003 when you went to the New York Fed. But I think it's really helpful to go back even before that, as you did in your book, about your education for crises, because that really shaped, I thought, that was a formative experience for you. Tell us a little bit about your own personal journey and then going on to work in the Treasury Department in the 90s.
Okay. Well, I, because of this great gift my parents gave me, I grew up mostly overseas, but decided I wanted to work for my country and joined the Treasury as a civil servant in 1988. And had this amazing experience. I didn't have any appreciation for how valuable it would be later, of being part of helping a bunch of countries deal with pretty classic financial crises, some of them with pretty close to Great Depression-like outcomes, which happened in the late 90s with brutal force and pace. And I had this very valuable, in part because it helped illustrate to me how fragile these systems were, how little they were understood, and how damaging they were when things fell apart. Mm-hmm. And also a little bit of an experience in what it took. You can't protect people from a huge amount of damage in a financial crisis, but you can do things to make them much less damaging than they can be. And it was a bit of an education in learning a little bit about what it takes. Larry Summers, my very close colleague, took this as a way to simplify this doctrine of strategy. He took Colin Powell's doctrine for national security, simplified as overwhelming force. And he
said an overwhelming force solved the problem. The Pottery Barn rule.
That's a corollary.
Yeah, that's a corollary.
Yeah, that's a corollary.
Once you break it, you got to send an overwhelming force to fix it.
Yeah. I mean, he said, you can't act unless it's overwhelming in national interest. But if you're going to act, make sure you put overwhelming force behind it and make sure you have a clear exit strategy. Larry had a simple way of applying that. It's a good, simple way of thinking about what it takes in financial crises too. So anyway, I had this education in crisis and a little bit in the politics of crisis, which was very fortunate, in partly because it taught me a lot of humility, I think, about what was possible, and a lot of caution and a lot of fear.
Mm-hmm. But you had, help us remember, in the 90s, it started with Mexico, but you had a series of almost contagious crises that went across the world in Latin America and Asia.
It went from Mexico in 95, and then the next one really was Thailand in 97, then Thailand, Indonesia, Korea in really quick succession, then Russia, and then Brazil, with a lot of collateral damage. And as you said, it was in some ways a perfect example about how runs work, how classic runs and panics work, how they spread, how contagion spreads, how hard it is when panic sets in for people to differentiate among the strong and the less strong. The tendency is for self-preservation leads people to run from really anyone who looks vulnerable, and that causes a lot of indiscriminate collateral damage.
And in this new globalized world, it's not only interconnected, but money moves much more rapidly.
It moves very, very rapidly. Although, it's worth reminding people that, the thing about financial crises, which is so tragic and I would say kind of discouraging, is that they can happen really quickly and with a lot of force in pretty simple, old-fashioned financial systems, pre-technology.
Right.
So if you just think about the panics of the late 19th century or even the decades before the Great Depression, they happened actually pretty quickly, and they were brutal too in their force. So it's true that globalization, technology changed a little bit the dynamics of it, how powerfully they can spread. But the Great Depression was a global crisis.
Right. So you learned over a series of these crises what you saw what didn't work in Japan, and then you learned how to go with the IMF, how to go with U.S. support to work through crises. So you learned sort of some of the manuals in your own head about what to do. But you also said something interesting. You also learned about the politics of crises and how politics and policy can conflict.
Yeah, I had a pretty searing initial discouraging education in the politics of these things. I mean, with just one example, when I was a civil servant, I would sit behind Secretary Rubin and Alan Greenspan in the hearings they were doing on Mexico. Those two men were really at the apogee of their public credibility, I would say. And I had tremendous respect for them. I thought the things we were doing were overwhelmingly in the country's interest, overwhelmingly. And I watched them in those hearings. It seems quaint relative to today's standards, but for the time it was brutal. Mm-hmm. It was brutally savage. Mm-hmm. Basic derisive condemnation of their motives, of their competence.
For the U.S. to go in and rescue Mexico or other.
Well, it was against both the case, the cause, but also how we were doing it. Right. And that was, you could maybe say helpful in the wrong way, but it definitely lowered my expectations about the capacity to try to reconcile the inherent tension between what it takes to try to reduce the damage and what is appealing and popular. I mean, the reason why we have financial crises over time with this sort of tragic, repetitive feel to them is not just because these are systems made of humans prone to periods of excessive optimism and panic, but because the initial instincts of governments in a crisis are in a severe crisis are pretty much the opposite of what you need. They're pretty much the opposite in the sense that the initial instinct is to hope it burns itself out, to try to take no risk, or to worry about the moral hazard implications of intervention.
Can you explain what moral hazard is? Some people, the phrase actually doesn't have as much meaning as the idea behind it.
Moral hazard is a way to describe the risk that if you give people the sense you're going to protect them from their mistakes, they'll take too many risks. So at the center of finance is this basic dilemma, which is that if there's this expectation that the government will step in and protect creditors or investors or depositors, that they will be less discerning in the risks they take, institutions they support. And so the hazard in that expectation of protection is the risk that it creates the seeds of future crises. So this challenge about moral hazards is the center of the design of financial systems. It's at the center of part of what makes financial systems vulnerable to collapse. And the typical instinct, understandable human instinct and desirable instinct really of policymakers, economists, central bankers in a typical financial mess is to let the fire burn. Because the fire is judged as not just, because it's penalizing the arsonist, but it has this desirable benefit of inducing some more caution in the future. And that instinct, which is so human understandable and so intuitive, is the right instinct probably, and probably the right strategy in lots of financial events. You know, in the typical, you have a mild recession or a large institution makes a terrible mistake out of venality or incompetence. You'd like them to fail. You'd like the people that finance that to take all those losses. That's the just, desirable thing, not just the intuitive thing.
You called it Old Testament justice.
As a simple, vivid way of saying it. But in a panic where you really can't, where there's a run generally, and the risk of losses or indulging that instinct risks adding fuel to the fire, you pretty much have to, the moral thing to do in that context is just to make sure you're protecting people from the risk of massive damage, and that requires trying to put out the fire. So the part of my that early education in crises was to sit through debate after debate after debate among policymakers and economists about just this basic thing. In a crude way, maybe we should let Mexico burn because that would be less likely that investors around the world would go finance a huge investment boom in Asia. It's not to overdo it, but it's sort of an interesting moral choice.
But if you don't rescue them, then there's a possibility that the panic will spread and a lot of people get hurt.
Exactly, and it's not like a theoretical thing. We ran a national experiment in this instinct in the fall of '08. Not to skip ahead, so we can come back to this, but it's just an understandable instinct for this stuff. And in the fall of '08, even Monday after Lehman failed, the New York Times editorial page and the Wall Street Journal editorial page celebrated the failure. The overwhelming dominant fever, it was a fever in public conventional wisdom at that time, was that this was a just fire. The losses it was imposing on the system, the financial system, were just and welcome and would have no effect on us, no effect on the average person. Just a deep confusion of belief about how these things affect things. And what happened in even the weeks after that, you saw that belief hold a lot of power still. And yet, when it was given too much deference, like in the failure of one of our largest banks, WAM was a good example, all it did was accelerate the panic. And ultimately, think about the paradox. Ultimately, that panic got so forceful that the size of the shock that hit the United States in those weeks was 5 times larger than the shock that hit the US economy at the beginning of the Great Depression. And ultimately, it took much more massive Powell Doctrine protection guarantees, support, safety net for the system to prevent people from the Great Depression scale mass unemployment, breadlines, soup kitchens across the country for a decade. So this paradox, which is so counterintuitive still, is that instinct, which is to try to solve the crisis in effect by letting the fire burn, which is probably right and just in many states of the world, is the opposite of what you need in a panic. So I had a little bit of education in that, not too much, but little education, because in all those debates about the emerging economies, it was exactly the same debate. Should we provide them substantial financial assistance on conditions that would reduce the risk their economy contracts by 20%? Or should we go ahead and let it contract by 20% in the hopes that would have a nice disciplining effect on the enthusiasms of the creditors in the future. It kind of a, it's a moral choice
Right.
in many ways, and it's not as if you can ignore the Old Testament imperative or the moral hazard thing. It's just you have to figure out a way to reduce that future risk once you've satisfied your core obligation if you're governing, which is to protect the average person, the innocent victim, from the calamity of mass unemployment.
So we're going to skip more than I'd like, but in the interest of time, because we have so little time to discuss really complicated and massive issues. You were there then as president. You worked in Treasury, civil servant. Then you had a brief tour at the International Monetary Fund, and then you went on from there to become a very young president of the New York Fed, one of the most powerful jobs in our economy. Very, very important job in New York. You're essentially the vice chair of the Fed, and you were there. This was during the Bush administration. And when the trouble hit, when the crisis broke, and you had to decide on whether you would go for a massive package, which the president did, to rescue the banks. And you worked with Paulson, and you worked with the president. Can you tell us a little? Can you walk us through those initial decisions before you became Treasury Secretary?
Sure. We had a long boom in the years before '08, and it started to come undone in the summer of '07, where you had the first signs of run. By the spring of '08, when Bear Stearns was about to fail, and then with more force, more momentum over the course of the summer, that classic run gained a bit of force. Ultimately, threatened to consume Fannie and Freddie and then the rest of the system. But you couldn't really see the run because it wasn't really bank lines across the country, although we had one little episode of that in the summer of '08. It was a less visible run. And the recession at that point was really still just a fear. It didn't really, unemployment hadn't started to move up dramatically, so people couldn't really see or feel the consequences. But in the weeks of September '08, and the weeks after that, it tipped over into classic full-scale panic. And we had at that point, going into what people call Lehman weekend, basically all the investment banks were at the edge of collapse, and so was AIG. And then in the aftermath of the trauma of those few days, there was a run on money market funds. The commercial paper market, which is a critical funding vehicle for businesses across the country, basically shut down. And you had this traumatic loss of wealth. I don't mean wealth just for the rich, but just in a more like the value of people's homes, the value of their savings, and you saw businesses react to that by cutting savagely into employment, cutting savagely into their investment plans. And those things were just reinforcing each other with brutal force. But Paulson said, I think correctly, that we were 3 days away from the ATMs not working, meaning some risk that people, at least for a substantial part of their savings, would find them caught, lost in a bank that was going to fail. And you saw failures of institutions across the country start to escalate in that context. And so, President Bush and Hank Paulson and Bernanke made the really difficult political decision, but very courageous decision, to say that we needed more authority, more firepower, because at that point, all the country had was the reach of the Fed, very limited, not designed for this kind of thing. We don't equip our presidents with the powers we give them against national security threats. We don't give them those powers in finance because of this deep moral hazard conviction. Understandable that if you create a standing safety net with discretionary authority to the executive to step in and do indiscriminate bailouts, the fear is that creates the risk of future crises. So presidents have almost no authority to respond to a financial panic, and so Bush and Paulson, to their credit, went to the Congress and asked the Congress for more firepower, and Congress gave it to them, although there's some gnashing of teeth before that happened. And ultimately, we had a better set of tools, and we could sit there and figure out what was a good strategy to break the panic. And ultimately, what it took was a really massive amount of financial force in terms of guarantees and a massive injection of capital into about 3/4 of the banking system. But of course, even with all that, at that point the fire was so strong, even with all that, by the time Obama was sworn in, we'd done trillions and trillions of dollars of stuff, and the economy was collapsing at an accelerating rate then. So we were so far behind the curve, it had so much momentum that even with that authority, we had a collapsing economy, and we had to go back and get a bunch more.
Right. So here you come in. You're writing the first page of your book. By the way, this book it's a very good read. I thought, I'm going to be reading a sort of an economics tome about banking and so forth. And I'm not sure I can understand any of it. And I got into it. This is a really good read, so I commend it to you. But you write there on the first full day as Secretary of the Treasury, I met with President Obama in the Oval Office. The worst financial crisis since the Great Depression was raging. The broader economy was contracting at a depression-level rate. Consumer confidence had collapsed to an all-time low. Millions of Americans were in danger of losing their jobs, their savings, their homes. That's what you inherited. And the first thing you had to tell the president was there were 5 big bombs to be defused. What did you do? You must have been scared.
Again, we'd already done this terribly offensive, deeply unpopular things. When I first met him in October of '08, and he said to me, I might have to ask you to come to Washington. I said, well, you shouldn't do that. And I had a lot of reasons for him. One reason was I said, I was up to my neck already in designing this initial stage of the rescue, and it's deeply unpopular. And I'm not going to separate myself from it, and it'd be harder for you to separate yourself from it if you asked me to come work for you. So anyway, January, we're sitting in his office, and I was about to go tell him it was so much worse than he thought, because after putting all this deeply offensive stuff into the economy to look like we were rewarding the arsonists, we still had 5 massive global institutions still not viable on the brink of collapse, and it was going to take a lot of additional unpopular stuff that would consume a lot of his political capital very early.
Right.
And as I said, that what was, in some ways, the fall of '08 was terribly scary because we all felt we were at the edge of the abyss and the world economy was collapsing around us. January was, in some ways, it was worse because, as I was saying, we'd already done, pretty without precedent things to prevent collapse, and yet the country was collapsing beneath us. So what the president did, I think to his enormous credit, is he asked Congress for some fiscal authority larger than, not large enough, but larger than what Roosevelt did in the Great Depression in relative terms. And then we had to design, and Bernanke was Bernanke's national hero was doing all sorts of new creative stuff to expand the frontiers of central banking. But that wasn't enough because the financial system was still short of capital, still sucking oxygen out of the economy. And the economy was not going to grow again, we're not going to pull back from the abyss unless we got the system functioning again. So what we had to do was try to figure out what that next stage of strategy would be and how to make it effective. And he said to me, again, to his credit in that first meeting, he said, I want you to rip the Band-Aid off. I want to do the hard things now, just not try to paper them over. Very worried about repeating Japan sort of chose we had these 2 counterexamples before us. We had the Great Depression, that was terrible. And we had Japan, who chose a decade of drift, really, just to move sideways, which was pretty costly for the economy too, much less costly than the Great Depression, but neither of those strategies looked appealing to him. And he wanted us to basically put the politics aside and try to figure out what had the best chance of getting the economy growing again, even if it was going to be politically costly to him, but not leave us with a weakened system in the future. He was very good in that moment, I thought.
Good. And so the strategy that you embraced seemed to have 3 parts: financial rescue, monetary stimulus, fiscal stimulus. Those seem to be the 3 pillars of what you were trying to do.
Yeah, think about it this way. Monetary policy doesn't really work if your banking system is is collapsing, because any little accelerator try with monetary policy runs against the brake that the system's applying. Lower interest rates doesn't really help people if they can't borrow to buy a car or to buy a new home. Fiscal policy also doesn't have that much power unless the system is functioning. So what we did is a very novel thing, which is the title of my book, which is to design this strategy for trying to get the system working again. And we used, again, a pretty counterintuitive, scary thing for people at the beginning too, is we said we're going to force a level of transparency on banks that they'd never been subjected to, so people could see what losses they might face in a Great Depression, force them to go raise capital to cover those losses, and make it clear if they couldn't raise capital from private investors, we'd put public capital in. And people were worried that it wouldn't be tough enough, wouldn't be credible enough, or the transparency would be too scary, or they wouldn't raise capital, we have to put in all this capital, effective nationalization on a large scale, which were all legitimate concerns, but in some ways because of the force of the fiscal stimulus and the monetary stimulus, and because the Fed designed a very credible, very transparent test, very exacting test, it was reassuring to people to sort of see how bad it might be. And with amazing alacrity, investors around the world came and put money into the US financial system on a very large scale, so that as tax custodians of the taxpayers' money, we didn't have to put in any incremental dollars.
You never had to go back for a second TARP.
Not only that, but we never had to deploy additional capital into the bank, except in the case of one large institution, a modest-sized institution, GMAC. So it was scary to people. I don't know if you remember. I gave a speech on February 9th, which was not wildly not received very well.
That first speech?
For lots of reasons. But
is that the one Barney Frank said you look like you're just on your way to your bar mitzvah?
Yeah, Barney Frank said that when I appeared in public, I looked like I was at my bar mitzvah. But partly why that was such a scary moment is because we sucked the hope out of the air then that we were going to do a big generous use of taxpayers' money to buy these assets out of the banking system at inflated prices, leave the taxpayer without risk. The markets were hoping we would do that. We said we weren't going to do it, and we laid out this thing they'd never heard of, called a stress test, completely untested. Deep skepticism around it, and it took a sort of sustained effort of gradually revealing the details of it to reassure people, and it was very effective. Can I just say that don't confuse my enthusiasm for the efficacy of some of the things we did with confusion about what we failed to do, or all the problems we still left the country.
Right. But the central argument of your book is a lot of what you all did was unpopular, but it worked far better than people understand. Right. I want you to have an opportunity to lay that case out. Why you think it? What evidence do you have that it works so well? I want people to hear that evidence.
Well, let's, Barney Frank said once again, to quote Barney again, you can't run for office on the platform of it could have been worse. But it's not a theoretical, it's not a hypothetical thing. I mean, it's just hard. People didn't have any memory of this, but again, in the Great Depression, which at the outset saw a financial shock 1/5 as severe as we saw at the beginning of this crisis, had 25% unemployment, economy shrank by 25%, and it was pretty much like a decade of shanty towns and breadlines. If you don't like that example, you can look at the 5 financial crises the U.S. had in the 50 years before that. Pretty similar bad outcomes. Or if you don't like that example, you can look at the emerging market crises of the 90s. It wasn't a hypothetical, theoretical thing that it could have been worse, even in this terrible recession we had. And remember, again, think about we're sitting there watching the thing collapse around us, around the world, And already, by many dimensions, it's much, much worse in magnitude than at the beginning of the Great Depression. And we did a set of things which, on their face, were going to look deeply unfair, except relative to the alternative. You'd say that why was it fair or necessary to keep the lights on the financial system or look like you're rewarding the arsonists? But it was only more fair than leaving the economy to deal with the consequences of a broader collapse. No chance, I still don't believe, no chance to make that accessible or understandable to people. Again, because no living memory of what panics are like, no living memory in the United States of what panics cause. And the things we're doing to put out the fire, again, have this deeply counterintuitive, offensive character because they have so many collateral beneficiaries, unintended, undesirable collateral beneficiaries. I think impossible to really think. But it's not like we were living with we were trying to prevent the hypothetical, highly unlikely, speculative, implausible bad outcome. We were trying to prevent the almost certain outcome of vastly greater devastation by order of magnitude than even the terrible damage left. And again, just to go to just to make it harder in some ways, remember, most people, I think, even in the fall of '08, maybe even today, still think that the error their government made was to be too generous with the rescue, which may be in some ways, but let's go back again to what it was like in the fall of '08 or early '09. All of that damage to the American economy, much of which we're still doing today, was the cause of the fact that the fire was allowed to burn in some ways too hot. It got away from us, partly because we didn't have the authority to contain it until we went to Congress, but partly because we were working against this overwhelming instinct still of politicians and policymakers in many places that, no, this is good. Let it burn. It'll be just in its impact. So all that damage we went through, all that damage we're still left with, all those scars are still mostly a result of the fact that it took until October of '08 and then January of '09 for this country, strongest country financially on the planet, to decide to escalate massively and figured out the mix of things that were going to be required to prevent unemployment again from going to 25%.
You also made the argument how much that it wound up, the taxpayers didn't actually lose money in the rescue.
Right. You can't, I want to be careful about this. You don't want to measure the success of these things we did on whether we earned money for the taxpayer because, frankly, even if we lost a fair amount of money, they were necessary and would have been effective by the right measure. What's the right measure? The right measure should be how quickly do we get the economy growing again? How forcefully did we take out the risk of even much greater damage? And again, this economy, which was shrinking annually to 8% in the fall of '08, in the last quarter of '08, was growing again in 6 months. Amazing turnaround in that context. That's the best measure. Because what did that growth mean? It's not like a hypothetical thing, this growth. Growth means that we were much closer to the point where people were going to stop losing their jobs and get rehired, much closer to the point that income was going to grow more broadly, much closer to the point where people were going to restore the damage to people's savings. Those are like deeply generalized benefits, very direct benefits, and that's the best measure. But since you asked, in early '09, I would say the conventional view among experts, cited widely, was that we would lose $1 to $2 trillion on the direct cost of the financial rescue. And these programs, again, because they had this, because they were really, frankly, so forceful, so close to Pal Doctrine, will earn a positive return for the taxpayer over time of between $100 and $200 billion.
How much?
Between $100 and $200 billion. The S&L crisis cost the United States 3.5% of GDP. That was a tiny little financial crisis, tiny. Incredibly costly to the taxpayer. And because we adopted a very dramatically different strategy with much more force to it, we got the taxpayers' money back from the financial system, and in effect made them pay for the support we gave them. Now you could say we didn't make them pay enough. Maybe we could have made them pay more for it. But the popular perception that what we did was give this unnecessary, unjust gift of the taxpayers' money we'd never see again that could have better used for unemployment insurance. Yeah. It's really the inverse of what we actually did. We had a really massive fiscal stimulus that put a fair amount of money, not as much as we would have liked, as the president would have liked, directly into the hands of Americans, and indirectly into the benefit of Americans, money for teachers staying in the classroom or infrastructure, things like that, but also just directly through tax cuts or benefits or unemployment insurance. The scale of that was about $1.6 trillion. And the financial rescue, which was so deeply unjust in its core, we made them pay for. And I don't think that knowledge of that math is really helpful to the wounds caused by the crisis or the injustice. So I don't like to use as the best measure what we did. I just like to say it's a little better than you think in terms of its fact. There's more resources available for us to fund education, to fund the safety net, to fund health care for poor people and for retired people than we would have had otherwise. But the most important thing is that we got the economy growing in 6 months. That's the best measure.
In fairness, we should take up some of the arguments of your critics, because your book, other publications recently have really revived the debate about, and as people look back retrospectively, in particular, you have your new book is out. Elizabeth Warren has her book out, and they have diametrically opposed views of what this was all about, what happened. She writes that, quote, "You believe the government's most important job was to provide a soft landing for the tender fannies of the banks. Big corporations hire armies of lobbyists to get billion-dollar loopholes into the tax system and persuade their friends in Congress to support laws that keep the playing field tilted in their favor. Meanwhile, hardworking families are told they'll just have to live with smaller dreams for their children."
Well, I write in the book with some admiration for Elizabeth, not just because of what she did with this, with me and with the president on the cause of consumer protection, but also how she spoke about and how she still talks about this set of broader challenges facing the country. And she gives voice to a view about this country and the role of government that I have a lot of respect for, enthusiasm for, support for. But she does represent too, and she did at the time, still does today, this view which many people held, which we were motivated by a set of desires and objectives that were confused, mistaken, if not venal. And I think that critique, I won't attribute it to her, but I think that critique of the president and the people around him, I think is deeply offensive to them, because although again, what it was necessary to provide a more just outcome for the innocent victims of the crisis was going to look offensive on its face. It would be nice if something would be possible without that. The people who helped shape that were motivated only by, and remember, he's a Democratic president, elected with a very substantial mandate, surrounded by some very talented political people, some way talented legislative people, and a pretty interesting mix of progressive economists. They're motivated by one thing, which is what's going to be the most effective path to reduce the risk of more unemployment, maximize the chance people get back to work. That's a completely progressive value motivation. And the idea that there was some different motivation coloring our judgments is I think, deeply unfair. And although you could say maybe understandable, given that on the face of what we did looked like we were rewarding the arsonists. but it's also based on I think, a deeply, maybe understandable confusion that somehow there could have been better outcomes for the average person if we just step back and let the system collapse. And I think everything we know about crises and panics in history, and it wasn't a hypothetical thing, was that the damage to those broader progressive values and interests would have been terrible if we'd stepped back and let the system collapse.
But could you have done more?
And could we have done more?
Could you have done more for Main Street?
The tragic thing was that we were unable to relax the political constraints that we faced in legislating more stimulus, more benefits, longer. And this president was very successful in getting that initial powerful package of things, again, larger than what Roosevelt did in the Great Depression in relative terms, and asked for substantial additional chunks of authority over the succeeding years. But we got a fraction of those things through Congress, another $600 billion through Congress. Not enough, though, to compensate for the huge drag, huge pain on state and local governments, and not enough to compensate for the huge loss of demand. And that failure to relax those constraints was very consequential because fiscal policy turned too tight too quickly, and the country got caught up in this little fever about austerity enthusiasm too quickly. But I say this because that was the constraint. If we'd been able to relax that constraint, then this would have been a stronger recovery, and we would have healed more of the damage more quickly. But again, it wasn't because the president was, frankly, worried about anything except for how to limit the damage. And you could say that we were ineffective. It's true, we were ineffective in relaxing that constraint, getting more out of Congress. But if you look at the record of what he proposed, what we proposed, and what we pushed, you can see he was worried about the right thing, and that would have made a material difference. Fiscal policy, just to, not to use the math definition of it, but just to dimension it, fiscal policy probably pulled a percentage point of growth out of the economy each of the years following sort of summer of 2010. That sounds like maybe that doesn't sound like a lot. That's a lot. 1 percentage point. The difference between growing at 3.5% and 2.5% is a lot.
There was a study that came out from two economists at the University of Chicago here in the last couple of weeks. It made the front page of the New York Times, arguing that the real mistake, from their point of view, was that not doing enough for housing. And that you gave it short shrift in your book that you really paid attention to banks but not to housing, and you really could have helped the middle class by doing more. If you bailed out the homeowners as much as you bailed out the banks, people would have been in a lot healthier position.
Housing was vastly greater problem than the level of resources authority we had, and our results were terribly disappointing. Way short of what was needed. And again, we had a president with the right concern about it. We had a lot of people, fair amount of experience in financial crisis, know housing was going to kill us, knew the damage was going to be terrible, and put almost overwhelming pressure on us. We had some of the best housing people in the country, I think, in Sean Donovan, Michael Barr, very, very good, practical people in this case. And we just did not have a scale of resources or authority large enough to make more of a difference.
You think you should have asked for more?
And we tried to ask for more, but for reasons that I think, better than most people, there was just no willing appetite up there. The housing stuff was, in some ways, it was the least popular. Of course, the bank stuff was more unpopular, of course, but the housing stuff was very unpopular. Mm-hmm. A lot of people looked at the prospect of more help to help somebody modify a mortgage as just a reward for the imprudent. So on the Hill, no traction, no enthusiasm for more housing things. But remember, at its core, think of it this way: at its core, if you borrowed money to buy your house, and you lose your job, or your spouse loses your job, you're going to have mass foreclosures across the country. And there's no way to solve that except by providing huge amounts of money to help them pay their mortgages or helping them get jobs. maximize the chance that they'd be back to work more quickly. And we tried a mix of those things, but the scale of things we put into helping people get jobs back more quickly was much greater than in housing, in some ways because it was easier to get support for that. In housing, even for the stuff that would have more power. But again, I mean, not to overstate it, we did help millions of people stay in their homes, and we helped millions and millions of people refinance, take advantage of lower rates, and we helped put a floor under house prices at a time when people thought they would fall by another 30%. And gradually, over time, we created the conditions to start to repair that damage. Not enough, way too short of what was necessary, but not because we didn't understand the scale of the damage, not because we're not aware of the ideas out there. We were like full of ideas. We had great constructive advice from lots of cool people around the country motivated by the crisis. Our problem was the crushing gap between what was desirable and what was feasible in a country where that stuff has to go through a Congress.
As you know so well, governance depends to a considerable extent upon policies, but it also depends upon personalities and the people who are in leadership positions. I wonder if you could bring to life in sort of a 1 minute sort of quick capsule sense a few people, and just so we all have a sense of what it was like to be working with them. Let's start with Ben Bernanke. You call him the hero of the recovery.
Well, Bernanke is like, I described him as the Buddha of central banking. He's got this remarkable, calm, completely understated, very humble person with this great quiet force, student of the Great Depression, of course, deep awareness of the calamity that they can cause. Not political has become such a pejorative. It's not really, it shouldn't be a pejorative, it becomes a pejorative. Not political in any way. And just focused on the relentless challenge at that point of trying to change the frontiers of central banking, which he did, which will be a model for generations of central bankers in panics. But obviously terrifically smart and with him and Paulson, we'll get to Paulson, but we just had this great gift, which is we trusted each other. Mm-hmm. None of that deep, divisive competition, peacocky stuff that is so damaging and pervades so much of Washington.
It's striking in many ways, fortuitous, that at that moment when you came in as Secretary of the Treasury, you had one person at Treasury been through crises on the international front, and you had a Federal Reserve chairman who was a student, such a deep student of the Great Depression, that you had two people who were very familiar with that terrain. It was
a hugely lucky thing, but Paulson, in that critical period in the fall of '08, was decisive. He had, I think, in many ways, the hardest job because at that point we were short of authority to try to contain the damage, and he, with President Bush, had the incredibly difficult job of going to Congress and getting out of Congress at that deeply populist moment, divided Congress. Republicans running from it. He had that difficult time of trying to get them to give us the authority we needed, and I think that was the hardest job, and it probably maybe the most important thing that happened in that first stage, the fall of '08. And he's a tremendously strong. Also, I would say none of the adverse or the pejorative politics in him, nothing in that in him.
And Paulson.
Great at relationships, established these tremendously valuable relationships with Pelosi and Barney Frank in particular. Even with Chris Dodd, they had a tough time together, but that was important because the Boehner and McConnell found the Republicans running from them. So I don't know what the ratios were, but this was, was carried by Democrats. It was an authority asked for by a Republican Congress, a Republican president, and when they needed the votes, the leadership of the Republican Party in both houses couldn't deliver more than a tiny fraction of what they thought they would get. And the relations Paulson built with the Democrats, you would say it's kind of unlikely that would have happened. He did a great job of building those relationships, so he had a measure of their confidence and their trust and was able to get that.
President Obama.
Well, I'm a huge admirer of President Obama, and I try to give people a textured feel for what it was like to be there at that moment and watch the choices he made. And in some ways that began in the campaign because he gave a huge amount of cover and support to the then President of the United States and through the transition so that they were able to act in a very important way in stemming the tide of the panic before he was actually confirmed or sworn in as president. Again, just contrast that to the history of the Great Depression and in the relationship between Roosevelt and Hoover in that long transition beforehand, where Roosevelt, for a bunch of important reasons, decided that he would not give Hoover any cover, any support, and the country was really frozen for those damaging 5 months, which made the sort of accelerated the run more generally there. So Obama was excellent in that, I think pretty noble at that point. But my experience overwhelmingly throughout the time I was there was that he would be. Let's see if I can describe this to people. He would. I felt accountable. It made me accountable for coming to him with this set of horrible ideas for what we could do to put out the fire. But he subjected those proposals to pretty brutal internal debate. Not excessive, didn't let it go on forever, but he wanted to make sure that those ideas, proposals were subject to, the toughest evaluation. Larry was sort of the custodian of that process in many ways. But the president wasn't paralyzed by that debate. He didn't sit there, hoping that, somehow we'd find consensus where consensus wouldn't happen or find some way to make the politics better. He knew the politics would be terrible. And he was excellent at making decisions and excellent at, that basic choice. If you govern, if you're a president, this, David, life is about alternatives. So you have to judge your available options against the alternatives. It's not like you're judging your options against the ideal. You have to live in that with those basic constraints. And he was excellent in sifting through those things and making a choice, and when choosing, making sure that you had the full force of that office behind you in that context. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was for me at least, it was a great moment, a reassuring moment about people willing to look through the politics, the near-term politics of these kind of things, and not try to have it all ways, not try to satisfy all sides.
Are you surprised when you read pieces today, Democrats are accusing the president, Democrats, of being detached and not very competent?
I don't recognize really anything about him in what's become the conventional critiques of him. I think that
the president you knew was not what you're seeing today.
I don't recognize that. I don't think it's fair or just. I think that what people want from the president, understandably, is an ability to marshal the political issues of our country in support of solutions to problems that we are living with and scar the country today. And that aspiration, that hope, which is his burden, is not always invested with knowledge of the constraints on economics we put on the president, because in this country, anything with power to have a material effect on how many jobs are created, how fast we grow, the incentives we create for work, those things go through the Congress. And the Congress now is at a point where any solution that has likely to have any effect on anything good in the country economically is something you can't do with one party's votes. And it's going to split many of these ideas split both parties. You lose Democrats on them, you definitely lose a bunch of Republicans on them. And we're just going through a difficult period. We'll get through it at some point. Difficult period trying to figure out how to recreate, rebuild that core pragmatic, pretty American political thing, which is the capacity to build those coalitions from the center to make a difference on the economy. And I think people are putting all those constraints on him or attributing them to him, which I don't think is just.
Mm-hmm. You had a phrase that was very haunting in your book about Washington. You called it the soul-crushing pathologies of Washington. I'd like to go to some questions, if we might. Do you think it is demoralizing to the country that no bankers were prosecuted for their part in the financial meltdown?
I think it is demoralizing, and I think Americans deserved a tougher enforcement response. And I don't think people look at it today feel that they've been given that yet. And I guess what I encourage people to think about, I didn't get to make these choices. They weren't my choices. But I think if you have that view, what I encourage you to do is to try to figure out why that was the case. Because it's sort of an interesting thing. And if you look at the people who have written about this and gone to interview the prosecutors across the country charged with that piece of justice, some of their answers are troubling, and some of them are, and they're human, but a lot of them have to do with the fact that we ran a financial system for decades where we didn't put a set of clear rules, constraints, and a bunch of behavior that was terrible. You know, a lot of predatory abuse and things that were damaging took place in what is the modern equivalent of the Wild West of our financial system, not governed by a set of rules you could go force. Remember, those prosecutors had the right incentives, enormous political pressure on them to figure out how to bring a measure of accountability in this context. There were going to be careers going to be made on their success doing it, enormous powerful incentives on them. And they ran up against a kind of tragic thing, which is, well, I should let them make the case. I didn't make those judgments. But yeah, I agree that perception is widespread. I agree it's been damaging, very damaging, because it goes at the heart of a big part of why, or it's reinforced sort of a generalized loss of faith by so many Americans in the way our system works, the fairness of it, and the quality of governance you get from our institutions today.
There are a couple of questions in there asking about Dodd-Frank. 4 years later, only about half of the rules have been put into place. And the questions ask about, is this because of the lobbying that's going on from very rich, powerful interests?
You have to adjust this stuff by significance. If you look at the things that matter most to whether people get better protection against bad, predation in consumer finance, or if you look at it against the standard of whether the reforms that are likely to buy us the most stability in the future are advanced, those things are very advanced. Those core things about capital, shock absorbers against risk, limits on risk, have been in place for some time. They're much more broadly applied. They're much more conservative. They're much better designed. Those things are very powerful and very useful, and they're largely in place. So if you adjust for significance, the remaining regulatory things not done are just not as important as those core things. Why are they slow? They're not really slow, because in some ways they are, but in some cases they are, but not overwhelmingly slow because of capture by private interests. They're mostly slow because they're incredibly complicated, and because we left in place a ridiculously complicated oversight system with, 2 market regulators and 4 banks supervised at the federal level, and that oversight system is, it's the most balkanized, most complicated, most segmented system in any country on the planet, and that creates a huge amount of, you could say some competition for ideas, but mostly it creates molasses. And that's the biggest source of the slowdown.
Sure. Elizabeth Warren argues that the system is rigged against the little guy, against the people who aren't in power. How much truth is there in that?
Well, can I say it my way? Because I can't do it like the way she can do it with her power, but I'll give you what troubles me most about this. What troubles me most about this, if you look at our country today, we live with appallingly high levels of poverty for a country as rich as we are. the quality of education you get, the quality of healthcare you get, your sort of prospects in life, getting a job, earning a living for your family, still depend to an appalling level on the color of your skin or how rich your parents are. There's been this long period of no growth in the median income. There's still tremendous inequality in the opportunity people have in this country today. And our political system is frozen today, I think mostly by politics and ideology, but it's frozen in part by money. And remember, we designed a system, our founders designed a system where it's hard to do stuff, very hard to do stuff. And we created a system where it's easy for private interests, easier than it is true and than it should be true, in my view, to prevent and stop and block things that would make a material difference in the opportunity Americans face. That's a situation we should all lament. We should despair about that. But it's a system. So only politics can solve that. Mm-hmm. And it's something that and these are problems that governments can do a lot of things to ameliorate. These aren't challenges beyond our power to fix as a country. They just require, again, rediscovering this basic pragmatic capacity to govern that has been a source of so many of our advantages, our strengths as a country, but we seem to have lost.
Several questions are along this line. Given that banks consolidated even more after the crisis, isn't there a larger systemic risk present than before the crisis?
No. This basic concern about size, moral hazard, too big to fail, we should always worry about that. It's like the forever war. But by any measure, our system is much more stable, much less vulnerable as a risk than it was, I think, before the crisis. I'll just give you a few examples, although you may not find them compelling. We put in place a cap on how large banks could be as a share of the banking system. Can't be larger than 10%. You could say, well, 10%, maybe that's too large, too high, too permissive, but it's dramatically tighter than what exists in any country on the planet. We have a much less concentrated system anywhere. We have capital requirements on banks that are probably 3 times tougher, more conservative than existed before the crisis. And we put at our initiative, really my proposal, but our initiative we put a systemic surcharge tax in terms of capital in the largest institutions. And we have a system where we are much more likely to be able to be indifferent to the future failures of large institutions than we were before the crisis. And much more indifferent than you could be if you were German or British or Swiss
today,
or Canadian or Japanese today. Just to dimension it, banks in this country, including investment banks, in total, altogether, are about 1 times our national GDP, just to pick one measure. Now, they're 8 times the GDP of parts of Europe, 5 times GDP of parts of Europe, larger in Canada in relative terms. And banks in our country still only provide about 40% of credit to the economy. So I say this not to say because it's over, or we've solved the problem, or you shouldn't be worried about it, just to put it in perspective. If you like your people who are elected leaders in office worrying about problems facing the country today, ask them to tell you what their solution is to unemployment, to growth, to poverty, to education, to healthcare, to inequality, because those challenges are so much greater than the reform challenges that we still face in the financial system. And the returns to more reform and more policy and more creativity in those areas are going to be vastly more powerful than the remaining reforms you might extract over time in making the financial system safer. You should be on it, always on it. It's a relentless challenge, and we got more work to do. But it doesn't come close.
But you think that the reforms that have been put in place make it a much safer system?
A much safer system. Now, finance is inherently risky. You could never stand up and say that we've solved the risk of future financial crises. Never. Of course, we're still vulnerable over time to these things. Over time, people will become confident again, too confident again, and risk will find its way around these constraints. Mm-hmm. And hopefully, over a long period of time, you're going to see that same basic vulnerability we faced, and hopefully, we made a set of decisions in this crisis which will make it more likely our successors are able to do the things you could do with more power earlier to prevent the damage from those things. But the reforms absolutely are going to have a very good chance of buying us a pretty long period of relative stability. And I think the freedom now to ask our elected officials to devote their political capital to some of these other hugely challenging, deeply scarring remaining challenges we face.
It's interesting. Let's our time is running nearly out. One last question, more personal. You wrote a book, you called it Stress Test, and it obviously applied to the banks, but clearly you also intended it to apply to the United States, and you said the United States the system worked, and your judgment. But it's also a stress test for Tim Geithner. Tell us how it changed you, how it affected you.
It was a kind of a challenging. Yeah, but I should just say, by the way, you guys are all nice to come to this, but I wanted to thank you for supporting independent bookstores and the cause of books. I mean, one thing that was helpful to me in the midst of all that, apart from like having an amazing wife and family and group of colleagues around me, was I read voraciously every night. Not so much about central banking or moral hazard, but I read a whole diverse mix of things, and I found a lot of
over the last 10 years while you were in.
Yeah, but also just every night in the midst of the panic, I tried to create a little space to read because there's just a value in that. So I had a enormously rewarding time in public service, even with all the even with all the terror and the pain, because I got this chance to work for my country and work with people who were very talented and serve a president I deeply admired, presidents I admired, and I had to come to the work every day trying to figure out how to solve a problem that had no apparent solution. And even in all the pressure of that, I found that there was some calm I could find in that, because just that relentless challenge of trying to figure out, okay, but what could we do? Why could we try this? Why not that? That challenge of moving, of trying to solve problems, could always bring me a measure of calm. The things that were worse were when we were stuck, inert, frozen, unable to act. That was the worst.
But you came out of it. You said you came out of it more humble, especially your earlier experiences. Did you also? Has this been in some ways, deeply satisfying time for you? Just to be there, to have a chance to be there.
Well, I think that I told you that when the president asked me to take this told me he might ask me to come do this, I tried to talk him out of it, and then there was a time when I thought it was time for him to have somebody else in this job, and he tried to talk me out of that too. He did talk me out of that, but I feel very lucky that I got to work with him and serve him, because the country was burning, and it was my life's work in many ways, and I got to at least have the chance to do my best to try to help him navigate through that, and I feel really lucky I had that chance, and I feel I feel so lucky that I had this experience in public service of having that challenge of how to figure out, however imperfectly, however disappointing in many ways, and however sad and tragic in terms of the things we couldn't do. But it's a deeply rewarding experience, and I think that I hope more Americans over time will try to rediscover that sense of value in going to work for their country. And it doesn't need to be for life, but at least for part of their lives.
Tim Geithner, ladies and gentlemen.